It's easy to think of Alexander merely as a military conqueror, but this would be a profound mistake. Alexander's true genius lay in his understanding that conquest alone was meaningless unless followed by consolidation and transformation. From the beginning of his conquests, Alexander was not merely interested in plunder and military glory. He was interested in creating something lasting, a new world order based on the fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures. This is why he did things that seemed strange to his Greek generals and soldiers. When Alexander settled in Babylon after his conquests, he implemented several policies designed to bind his diverse empire together. He married Roxana, the daughter of a Persian nobleman, in a grand ceremony. More provocatively, he encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women. He himself adopted Persian court customs and dress. He demanded that his subjects prostrate themselves before him in the Persian manner, a practice deeply offensive to Greek soldiers who considered such prostration degrading. These actions caused enormous resentment among his Greek and Macedonian followers. They felt he was abandoning Greek culture and becoming corrupted by Eastern ways. Mutinies and conspiracies were common. Alexander's closest companions worried that he was losing touch with the values that had made him great. But from Alexander's perspective, these policies made perfect sense. If he wanted to rule a vast multicultural empire, he needed to learn to see himself as legitimate, not just to Greeks and Macedonians, but to Persians, Egyptians, Indians, and all the diverse peoples in his empire. By adopting their customs and marrying their women, he was signaling that he belonged to their worlds as well. Alexander also established numerous cities throughout his empire, most famously Alexandria in Egypt. These cities were built as centers of Greek culture and commerce, but they also served practical purposes. They were garrison towns that helped stabilize his conquests and centers where Greek and Eastern cultures could intermingle and blend. The cultural legacy of Alexander's conquests was immense. Greek became the lingua franca, the common language, of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East for centuries to come. Greek philosophy, art, architecture, and science spread throughout Asia, but it was never a one-way cultural flow. Alexander and his successors adopted Persian administrative systems, Eastern court customs, and incorporated local deities into their religious practices. Historians call this period the Hellenistic Age, the age when Greek and Eastern cultures blended together. It was directly created by Alexander's vision of a cosmopolitan, multicultural empire. Alexander was also fascinated by knowledge and learning. Wherever he went, he brought scholars and scientists. He had botanists catalog new plants, zoologists study unknown animals, and historians record his campaigns. He sent back specimens to Aristotle in Greece. He established new schools and centers of learning throughout his empire. The famous Library of Alexandria, while built after his death by his successors, was a direct product of his vision of creating centers of Greek learning throughout the East. In his own administration, Alexander adopted meritocratic principles that were quite advanced for the ancient world. Positions were given based on ability and loyalty, not merely on ethnic background or family connections. A talented Persian could rise to high position in his government. An Indian prince could be treated as an equal. This was revolutionary for the time. Alexander also showed remarkable tolerance toward local religions and customs. He didn't try to force Greek religion on the peoples he conquered. Rather, he allowed local temples to continue functioning. He made offerings to Egyptian and Persian gods. He consulted oracles and respected local holy sites. This religious tolerance helped him consolidate his rule and prevented the kind of religious rebellion that might have destabilized his empire. But for all his visionary qualities, Alexander also had serious flaws. His paranoia increased as his power grew. People who questioned his orders or his judgment might find themselves executed. Several of his closest companions were put to death on charges that may or may not have been justified. He became increasingly obsessed with his own image and legacy. Alcohol became an increasing problem. Ancient sources describe him as a heavy drinker, and several key incidents in his later life were connected to heavy drinking, including some of his most brutal actions. He also became convinced of his own divinity in a way that went beyond political pragmatism. He genuinely seemed to believe he was the son of Zeus Amun, This belief could be adaptive. It helped legitimate his rule across different cultures, but it also separated him from ordinary people and may have distorted his judgment. Still, by the time of his death, Alexander had fundamentally transformed the known world. He had shown that cultural boundaries were permeable, that a multicultural empire was possible, that the world was far larger and more interconnected than previously believed. In June of 323 BCE in Babylon, Alexander the Great fell ill. The exact nature of his illness remains one of history's great mysteries. Ancient sources give conflicting accounts. Some say he contracted malaria. Others claim he was poisoned. Some suggest he died from complications of alcohol poisoning. Still others theorize that he was suffering from multiple ailments that combined to kill him. What we know is that he grew progressively weaker over several days. He developed a high fever. He became delirious. Despite his physical weakness, his mind remained sharp enough to make crucial decisions about the succession of his empire. When asked who should inherit his vast dominions, Alexander reportedly said only, "to the strongest." These two words, if they were indeed his last words, proved prophetic and tragic. They suggested that his empire should go to whoever was strong enough to hold it. On June 10th, 323 BCE, at only 32 years old, Alexander the Great died. His death created an absolute catastrophe for his empire. There was no clear successor. His wife Roxana was pregnant with a son who would be born after his death. His illegitimate half-brother, Philip Arrhidaeus, was mentally disabled. His generals, the men who had conquered the world with him, began immediately to fight over the spoils. Within months, his empire began to fracture. His generals engaged in a series of brutal civil wars called the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. Over the next 50 years, Alexander's empire was completely divided up among different generals and their descendants. The three most significant of these successor kingdoms were, first, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, ruled by Ptolemy and his descendants. This kingdom lasted for nearly 300 years until it was conquered by Rome. Second, the Seleucid kingdom in the Middle East and Central Asia, ruled by Seleucus and his descendants. This became a major power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Third, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia, ruled by Antigonus and his descendants. This remained a significant Greek power until it too was conquered by Rome. What's remarkable is that despite the fragmentation of political unity, the cultural transformation initiated by Alexander persisted. Throughout the Hellenistic world, Greek culture remained dominant. The blending of Greek and Eastern cultures continued. The libraries, schools, and centers of learning he established became the foundation for what we now call the Hellenistic civilization. In this sense, Alexander's empire didn't really end with his death. It transformed. Political unity was lost, but cultural and intellectual unity persisted. But the question of how he died has haunted historians ever since. Was it natural illness? Was he poisoned by one of his generals? Modern medical historians have proposed various theories. Some suggest he died of typhoid fever. Others suggest malaria complicated by alcohol-induced liver failure. A few still argue for poisoning. The truth is, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that one of history's most powerful men was felled by something he couldn't fight with his sword or strategy: illness and mortality. What does it mean to ask about Alexander's legacy? In some sense, everything that happened in the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world for the next 3 centuries was shaped by his conquests and the empire he created. Let's start with the most obvious: geography and politics. Alexander's conquests made the entire Mediterranean, Middle East, and Central Asia part of a single connected world for the first time in history. Before Alexander, the Persian Empire had been the dominant power in the East, and the Greek city-states had been dominant in the West, but they remained somewhat separate spheres. Alexander's conquests created a single, unified geopolitical space. Even after his empire fragmented into 3 main kingdoms, they remained connected through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Goods flowed from India through Persia to Egypt and Greece. Ideas traveled in the same networks. Technologies were shared and improved upon. The Silk Roads, the famous trade routes that would connect China to the Roman Empire, became possible partly because of the infrastructure and political stability Alexander created. His cities served as trading posts and centers of commerce. The network he established laid the groundwork for millennia of global trade. From a cultural perspective, Alexander's impact was equally profound. He spread Greek language and culture throughout Asia. For centuries after his death, Greek remained the common language in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. When Christianity emerged in the 1st century CE, it spread primarily through Greek-speaking communities established in the cities Alexander had founded. Greek became the language of scholarship, science, and philosophy throughout the known world. The great centers of Greek learning that flourished after Alexander's time, like Alexandria in Egypt, became the true heirs to the Greek intellectual tradition. Here, Greek scholars worked alongside Egyptian, Persian, Indian, and other learned men to advance human knowledge. Scientifically, Alexander's conquests had important effects. By opening up contact between the Greek world and the Asian world, new plants, animals, and technologies were discovered and exchanged. His patronage of scholars and scientists established a model for scientific inquiry that would influence Western science for millennia. The Great Museum and Library of Alexandria, while built after his death, was directly inspired by his example and his vision of creating centers of learning and scientific inquiry. Militarily, Alexander's legacy was enormous. His tactics and strategy are still studied in military academies around the world. His key insight that well-coordinated, disciplined troops could defeat much larger armies shaped military thinking for centuries. His use of combined arms, infantry, cavalry, and siege weapons working in concert became the model for ancient warfare. The phalanx formation he perfected remained the dominant military formation in the Mediterranean world until it was eventually superseded by Roman tactical innovations. But even the Romans learned from Alexander's campaigns. Military history from Alexander until the present day is partly a commentary on and refinement of the tactical lessons he demonstrated. But perhaps Alexander's most important legacy was more philosophical and psychological. He showed that one man could change the course of history. He demonstrated that youth and energy combined with intelligence and ambition could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. He proved that cultural boundaries could be transcended and that people of different backgrounds could be unified in common cause. To his contemporaries and to later generations, Alexander represented the ideal of human potential. Roman generals dreamed of equaling his conquests. Later, European conquerors modeled themselves on him. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered the ancient world, Alexander was one of the most celebrated figures from antiquity. This idealization of Alexander is interesting because it often ignores his serious flaws and the human cost of his conquests. Hundreds of thousands of people died in his wars. Entire civilizations were destroyed. Slavery was widespread in his empire, as it was in all ancient empires. He was paranoid, increasingly tyrannical, and obsessed with his own image. But even acknowledging these faults, his historical importance is undeniable. He fundamentally changed the world. He created the conditions for the flowering of Hellenistic civilization. He established a new model of cosmopolitan rule that would influence how empires were governed for centuries. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander Free, lasting roughly from his death to the Roman conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean, was one of the most creative and productive periods in human history. Great advances were made in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and the arts. The scientific method developed as the dominant form of inquiry. Democracy in Athens may have declined politically, but it influenced the philosophical and intellectual foundations of later civilizations. All of this emerged from the world that Alexander created. In the long term, Alexander's empire was eventually conquered by Rome. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE is often taken as the end date of the Hellenistic period. But even Rome, which conquered the Greek world militarily, was profoundly influenced by Greek culture. Greek language, philosophy, and art continued to dominate in the Eastern Mediterranean even under Roman rule. So, in a larger sense, Alexander's cultural conquests were more permanent than his political empire. Even though his political empire lasted less than a decade in its unified form, his cultural influence lasted for centuries. Arguably, it's still present today. When we think of ancient Greece, we often think of Athens and the classical period of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But the Greeks themselves, after Alexander, increasingly thought of themselves as part of a larger Hellenistic civilization that spanned 3 continents. This shift in perspective, from the isolated city-state to the cosmopolitan empire, was perhaps Alexander's greatest achievement. Section 6. Alexander in Popular Culture and Historical Interpretation. 48 minutes to 55 minutes. Music, contemporary, engaging. Throughout history, Alexander has been a figure of fascination for different ages and cultures. Each era has tended to create its own version of Alexander, one that reflects the values and concerns of that era. To the medieval Islamic world, Alexander, known as Dhul-Qarnayn, appeared in the Quran as a builder of walls against barbarian invasions. He was a hero who protected civilization from chaos. This interpretation had nothing to do with the real Alexander, but it shows how his legend transcended historical fact. To Renaissance Europeans, Alexander represented the ideal of the humanist, the combination of military prowess with intellectual cultivation. He represented the possibility of using force to create a better world based on reason and learning. To 18th and 19th century Europeans, particularly Germans, Alexander was the supreme example of individual genius and will overcoming all obstacles. Philosophers like Hegel saw in Alexander the embodiment of world historical importance, the individual whose actions transform the course of human events. To modern scholars, particularly those influenced by post-colonial perspectives, Alexander is often seen more critically. His conquests are viewed as a form of imperialism. His destruction of local cultures is emphasized. His military campaigns are viewed as brutal and based on naked ambition rather than any noble cause. This multiplicity of interpretations reminds us that history is not merely a collection of facts, but a narrative that is constantly being reinterpreted based on present concerns. The real Alexander was probably quite different from any of these interpretations. He was a complex man with both admirable and terrible qualities. In popular culture, Alexander has appeared in countless films, novels, and television programs. Some of these portrayals have been reasonably accurate. Others have been wildly imaginative. Oliver Stone's 1994 film Alexander attempted to portray his life as a biopic, but took significant creative liberties. Various novels have imagined his personal relationships and internal thoughts in ways that go well beyond what historical sources tell us. What's interesting about all these portrayals is that they reveal what different times find compelling about Alexander. Modern audiences, for instance, are often interested in his personal relationships and his psychology. We want to understand his motivations, his fears, his desires. Ancient sources, by contrast, were often more interested in his military achievements and his role as a historical actor. Among historians, there's considerable debate about various aspects of his life and character. Some scholars emphasize his genuine interest in learning and knowledge. Others emphasize his ruthlessness and willingness to destroy anyone who opposed him. Some see his adoption of Persian customs as a visionary attempt to create a multicultural empire. Others see it as a betrayal of Greek values. One particularly interesting debate concerns Alexander's sexuality. Ancient sources make clear that Alexander had romantic relationships with men as well as women. Specifically, he had a particularly close relationship with his companion Hephaestion. When Hephaestion died, Alexander's grief was reportedly extreme. He went into deep mourning and reportedly had Hephaestion deified. Some modern historians argue that Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers in the sexual sense. Others argue they were merely very close companions and that applying modern categories of sexuality to the ancient world is inappropriate. The truth is, we simply don't have enough information to know for certain. What we can say is that Alexander had close, intense relationships with men in his life, and that this was not unusual or shameful in his society. This debate, while interesting, is ultimately somewhat secondary to understanding Alexander's historical importance. What matters most is what he achieved and how he changed history, not the intimate details of his personal life. What's most important to recognize is that Alexander was a product of his time, but also someone who transcended the limitations of his time in important ways. He inherited a kingdom from his father Philip, but he used that foundation to create something far larger. He was influenced by his tutor Aristotle, but he took Aristotelian ideas and applied them in ways that Aristotle himself probably would not have imagined. He was ambitious, certainly, but so were many other conquerors throughout history. What distinguished Alexander was his combination of military genius, political wisdom, and visionary thinking about how a multicultural empire could function. He was also capable of both great cruelty and remarkable grace. He could order the destruction of a city and then show mercy to the prisoners. He could be paranoid and suspicious and then surprisingly generous to those he trusted. In the end, perhaps what makes Alexander so fascinating is precisely this complexity. He wasn't a simple hero or a simple villain. He was a real man with real flaws, real ambitions, and real accomplishments, but his accomplishments happened to be so enormous that they reshaped history. Section 7. The World After Alexander, 5500 to 6200. Music, reflective, closing. To fully understand Alexander's significance, we need to consider what the world would have been like without him. It's an interesting counterfactual exercise. If Alexander had never lived, the Persian Empire would likely have continued to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East for at least another century or more. The Greek city-states would have remained divided and relatively weak. Greece would not have become the center of a vast empire. Greek language and culture would not have spread throughout Asia with such force. Without Alexander, the world would likely be much more fragmented. The great centers of learning that emerged in the Hellenistic period, particularly Alexandria, might never have developed. The synthesis of Greek and Eastern knowledge that produced so much scientific and intellectual advancement might not have occurred. The rise of Christianity, which relied heavily on the Greek-speaking world that Alexander had created, might have been prevented or significantly delayed. The structure of the Roman Empire itself, which eventually conquered Alexander's successors, was influenced by the model of empire that Alexander had demonstrated. It's possible to trace a line of influence from Alexander through the Hellenistic period, through the Roman Empire, to the emergence of the modern world. Each step in this chain relied on foundations laid by earlier steps. After Alexander's death, as we mentioned, his empire was divided among his generals, but this fragmentation was not as chaotic as it might have been. The reason was that Alexander had established enough infrastructure, enough common culture, enough common administrative practices that his successors could maintain a degree of order and cooperation even as they fought over territory. The three main successor kingdoms, Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, and Macedon, were major powers for centuries. Egypt, in particular, remained a superpower until its conquest by Rome in 30 BCE. The Seleucid Empire controlled vast territories in Asia and made important contributions to the development of mathematics and astronomy. Macedon remained a significant Greek power. Throughout the Hellenistic period, the memory of Alexander remained powerful. Kings modeled themselves on him, generals studied his tactics, scholars wrote about him, artists depicted him in sculpture and painting. His legend grew even as historical memory of the facts became obscured. This is worth emphasizing. Alexander's legend, in some ways, was even more important than the historical facts of his life. People across the ancient world knew his story, how the young Macedonian had conquered the world. This story inspired people, shaped their understanding of what was possible, influenced their behavior. When the Romans eventually conquered the entire Mediterranean world, they inherited the legacy of Alexander's empire. The infrastructure Alexander had built was still in place. The common language, Greek, was still in use throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The cultural assumptions about how a cosmopolitan empire should function still prevailed. So even though Alexander's political empire lasted less than a decade, the world he created lasted for centuries. In a real sense, we still live in the aftermath of Alexander, in the world shaped by his conquests and the Hellenistic civilization that emerged from them. As we wrap up our exploration of Alexander the Great, what can we conclude about this remarkable man? He was a military genius whose tactics changed warfare forever. He was a visionary leader who understood that conquest required not just military force, but also political wisdom and cultural sensitivity. He was a scholar and patron of learning who understood that knowledge was as important as power. He was also ruthless, paranoid, and increasingly tyrannical. He ordered the destruction of cities and the massacre of civilians. He became convinced of his own divinity in ways that distorted his judgment. He was not a simple hero. He was a complex human being whose actions had both positive and negative consequences. But what's undeniable is that he changed history. He created a world order that united East and West in unprecedented ways. He demonstrated that cultural synthesis was possible on a grand scale. He showed that an individual human being, possessed of exceptional talent and ambition, could fundamentally reshape the world. Alexander the Great died at 32, having conquered the known world and established an empire that changed the course of human civilization. He remains one of history's most studied figures, the ultimate example of human potential and ambition. Whether we admire him or criticize him, whether we celebrate him as a great enlightened ruler or condemn him as a brutal conqueror, one thing is certain: Alexander changed the world, and we still live in the world he changed. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and legacy of Alexander the Great. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what aspects of Alexander's life fascinate you most. Did you know any of these details? Are there other historical figures you'd like us to explore? We'd love to hear from you.